Hey everyone, this is Miss Valentine, and you are watching the Populations Dynamics Notes presentation for AP Environmental Science. Today we're going to talk about how populations operate in nature, and then next week we're going to talk more about the human population for specific information about demography. I will mention the human population, though, of course, because it's the one that we relate to the most. However, just remember that humans are part of nature, and our population can be subject to these laws of nature. So it's important to understand them before we start studying our human population next week. So we look at major characteristics of a population when we study them. The size of the population is the most common measurement that you hear about. The density is also important because it can determine how well a species can survive, as well as the genetic diversity that it has. Dispersion is how that species is spread out in the space that it's in. So we'll look at a picture of that in just a moment of clumped, uniform, and random dispersion. And then age distribution. So usually it's based on reproductive, pre-reproductive, and post-reproductive populations. That's where the age categories are broken out. Now, all together, these things, when we study them together and how they interact, it's called population dynamics. And that is, once again, just the study of populations in the broader scale of nature. So here are some pictures of different types of dispersion. And on your paper, you have 3 boxes to show each of these. You guys can just use little dots. You can draw little dots to represent them. So clumped is very simple. It's in little clumps. So you have herds of elephants. They often tend to stay in clumps, in groups. Humans also tend to clump together as well, though we also go with the random distribution as well sometimes. So, but clumped animals are all going to be in the same location but dispersed throughout in these clumps. Uniform distribution can happen naturally, but more often than not, it is a human uh, organized dispersion. So, especially when we do our agriculture and our farming, you're going to have things in neat rows to make it easier for us to access the plants that we need. So, often you'll see uniform distribution when you are in a agricultural setting. Random distribution, like the dandelions you see here in the picture, are they just pop up wherever their seed happens to fall. So random distribution is very common in nature, especially for things like plants that just kind of randomly pop up wherever their seed falls. So some other things that we look at when we look at population is the growth of the population. So this kind of goes under the category of population size, but we look at changes to the increase and decrease of the population size. Natality is birth. Mortality is death. And then if you have immigration, a term we're familiar with from our own human perspective, that's when organisms are moving into an environment. And then emigration, or I like to think of it as exit. So this is when organisms exit or move out of the environment. So you have natality and immigration bringing more organisms into the population, and then mortality and emigration with an E taking organisms out of the population. So when you put all of these together, you end up with a formula for population change. And that includes the birth and the immigration, so that's the increasing population, minus the death and the emigration, or the amount of organisms exiting a population. And that is your population change formula. Make sure you copy that down. And we will be doing some math problems with population growth, and then also with population growth rate, which is just basically putting that formula over time. But we'll talk a lot more about that, especially next chapter when we talk about human population growth. Zero population growth is when you have no change at all. And oftentimes, this is something you would see in a very small, controlled environment. Let's say, like the fish tank in the back of the room. If I take 2 fish out and add 2 more fish, then I have a zero population growth of fish. So it's usually in a smaller population that you see this happening, but it is a term that we also might use to describe the growth of a population. Here we are at our first pit stop for those of you doing Nearpod in the class. What are the major characteristics used to study population dynamics in nature? Biotic potential is a term that you'll need to know about populations, and it's just all of the factors that cause an increase in growth in a population. So think of the word biotic, it's life, like the potential for life, the potential for growth. The intrinsic rate of increase for a population, or abbreviated lowercase r, is the rate at which the population would grow on unlimited resources. And if you're familiar with studying populations, you might remember the J-shaped graph of population growth or exponential growth, and that is often the case for organisms that have unlimited resources. An example of a population with a high intrinsic rate of increase would be an organism that reproduces early in life, has shorter generation times, can reproduce many times, have many offspring each time they reproduce. And so a good example of this would be a common housefly, or many of the insects actually that we have a high rate, intrinsic rate of increase. And this also goes for microscopic organisms as well. So smaller organisms tend to have a high intrinsic rate of increase, more so than larger organisms. Environmental resistance is a term just to mean like resistance or pushback from the environment when a population gets too big. Sometimes you hear this called limiting factors. So it's all the factors that limit the growth of a population. That together is your environmental resistance. And that environmental resistance plus the biotic potential from the last slide, that is what determines your carrying capacity. And that's a term you should have learned in biology class about how large a population can get is the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity has more to do with the environment that the population is in. If there's a certain level of resources that is going to limit the population to grow to that level of resources that they can take advantage of. So the carrying capacity is just the number of individuals that a species the number of individuals of a species that the environment can continue to sustain. And carrying capacity can go up and down over time, depending on the environment that organisms are in. Another term you'll need to know, the minimum viable population, or MVP, is the minimum number of organisms in a population needed for the species to continue on and be successful. So this is one that we might hear often when we're dealing with conservation efforts, trying to help species that are having a difficulty maintaining that minimum viable population. They are more at risk of extinction. Below that, they may not be able to find mates, or even if they do find mates, they might have inbreeding, meaning like brothers and sisters are mating, and that produces weak offspring because of the lack of genetic diversity. Genetic diversity, if you remember from biology class and this class even, is very important for a species to be strong and to survive in the long term. So if you don't have that genetic diversity, it's not going to allow the species to adapt when new environmental conditions come along. So the giant panda and the black rhino are two examples of organisms that are struggling to maintain that minimum viable population. They are at risk of going extinct, and I actually do believe that a certain species of black rhino went extinct more recently. Or no, what happened was the male. There's one male left, and so if you only have one male black rhino in this specific species, the species is going to go extinct because you don't have a female to continue producing offspring. Here we are at the next pit stop for those of you doing Nearpod in class. Give an example of something that would cause the carrying capacity of a population to decrease in a certain environment. All right, so here are two different types of growth that we see in populations in nature. Exponential growth is when the growth might start out slow and then it increases in speed more and more rapidly. So this is often your J-shaped curve. And logistic growth, on the other hand, is one where the exponential growth has basically worn out and you are having a more steady increase. So this happens when a population comes up against environmental resistance or limiting factors, and that causes them to reach their carrying capacity. And it's not like they just reach their carrying capacity and it's clean cut. We'll talk about how it actually bumps up and down over that carrying capacity. So the population will fluctuate around carrying capacity once environmental resistance is reached. And this is a sigmoid curve or an S-shaped curve that is formed from the logistic growth when species end up reaching that maximum resource potential. So here are two very basic drawings of exponential growth versus logistics growth. And like I said, this line right here, if this were carrying capacity, the curve doesn't just smooth out like it does in this picture. It actually goes up above it. But this is just a basic, very basic example of a logistic growth curve. So you guys can draw that on your notes paper there. So when populations do actually exceed their carrying capacity, meaning they use more resources than they have, they will often overshoot the amount of resources. But then there is a lag in time between that overshooting of the resources and the slowdown in reproduction. So you still have the population increasing, and the death rates haven't started increasing yet. So you have this lag in time, and that's what causes the curve to go up over the carrying capacity. But eventually, you have to have that dieback or that crash because there's not enough resources to feed and continue to reproduce at that level. So if the organisms are able to switch to new resources, so if they're able to adapt, they have a lot of genetic diversity and are able to do that, they may be able to increase their carrying capacity so that they don't have a dieback or crash. And this is something that we've seen with the human species over the last several hundred years. We continue to increase our carrying capacity when we start to run out of resources. Easter Island is a really good example of when human species exceeded their carrying capacity and they ended up having a complete crash, not just a dieback below carrying capacity, but a complete crash. So let's watch that video right now so you can kind of have an idea of what happens when humans exceed their carrying capacity.
Today, Easter Island is famous for the massive stone heads scattered along its grassy coast.
Hi.
2,000 years ago, however, Easter Island was a 64 square mile slice of paradise, notable for its fertile volcanic soil, which gave life to a lush subtropical forest. The island was home to at least 25 species of nesting birds, 6 species of land birds, and a wealth of seal colonies and shellfish. 1,600 years ago, Polynesians arrived and began to settle the land. The abundance of plants and animals enabled these settlers to live large, and the population grew as the settlers feasted on the island's fruits and wildlife. Huge boats were constructed from the largest trees in order to provide porpoise meat for the growing population. To celebrate their success, the tribes of the island began to erect massive stone statues. 800 years ago, 800 years after the Polynesians arrived on Easter Island, the population had reached 20,000 and amassed more than 900 huge statues. By living so large, however, the population had fundamentally depleted the resources of the island. Within the next few centuries, the forest was completely eradicated. Every species of native land bird became extinct, and more than half of the nesting bird species and most shellfish species were wiped out. Unable to construct fishing canoes and running out of food on land, the inhabitants of Easter Island turned to cannibalism. 300 years ago, European explorers discovered Easter Island. At that time, the island's population had dropped to 2,000, and the island was a barren grassland. It was in the apparent best interest of the hunters to keep hunting, the loggers to keep logging, the masons to keep sculpting, and the chiefs to keep celebrating the wealth of their tribes. However, the steady demand of these people was not met by a steady supply of resources. Had each person changed their habits to match the circumstances? the islanders may have been saved. Though once this had been realized, the islanders could no longer escape from their island. Today, humanity faces a similar circumstance, and like the inhabitants of Easter Island, we cannot escape from our diminishing plot of resources. We can, however, learn from past mistakes. Find out more at finsustain.com.
All right. So oftentimes, the current state of humanity is compared to Easter Island. Like Earth right now is a huge example of Easter Island. Will we continue to use up all these resources? There's only so far that we can increase our carrying capacity before we start to experience this dieback and this crash. So the question is going forward for the human species is what are we going to do about this? We are already possibly reaching our carrying capacity. We actually don't know what our carrying capacity is, but are we going to do something to make sure that we can live sustainably? So that's, again, a big theme of this class. Here is a graph showing populations of sheep in a certain area. I think it might be New Zealand or I can't remember what country it was. But anyway, so they had this huge explosion of sheep with plenty of resources. They had plenty of grass, plenty of land, plenty of mates, and they continued to grow until they overshot what we figured out is their carrying capacity. So once that carrying capacity happens, or once they reach that carrying capacity, they actually go over it, and then they have this dieback. But once you go below carrying capacity again, then you have more resources and can reproduce more. And so this is what happens when a species does reach its carrying capacity. But I will remind you that the carrying capacity can go up and down depending on the environment that the organisms are in. And it could be that they're in the same environment, but there's just changes like climate change or wildfires or habitat destruction that cause their carrying capacity to go down. And then there's also adaptability. So if certain organisms are very diverse, they have a greater chance of increasing their carrying capacity, of being able to take advantage of resources in other environments and continuing their species. So again, carrying capacity, although you can see in this graph in this specific location, it can be determined just by looking at the way the population goes up and down. That line, that carrying capacity line, can go up and down. So the things that might affect carrying capacity include competition in an area. So organisms may compete for different food sources or water sources. Immigration and emigration, so how species are moving into and out of an area, and oftentimes that can be seasonal as well. Any catastrophic events, either human or natural caused, and then seasonal fluctuations. This happens again, like winter comes and you have fewer food resources for certain organisms, so they have a dieback in that situation. So seasonal fluctuations are something that could impact carrying capacity as well. There are different controls on a population size. So these are things that keep the population from growing too big. Again, this can also be related back to the idea of limiting factors. So there's density independent population controls or limiting factors that limit the population size. And they affect a population regardless of the size of the population. So these are things like fires or weather, climate, wildfires that will kill a certain number in the population, no matter how big the population is. A good example is like mosquitoes in the wintertime. They die off because of the temperature, or bugs in general can die off because of the deep freeze. And it has nothing to do with how big that population is going into the season. The density dependent limiting factors or population controls, they have a bigger effect when the population is large. So when you have a more densely populated area, you see more competition for resources, you see more predation, parasitism. Disease is actually a very good example of a density dependent limiting factor. And so when we started our coronavirus pandemic, you noticed that the greatest amount of infection and deaths was in areas that were densely populated, in the cities, in the urban areas. So that's a good example of disease and how it spreads more easily in a population that is more dense. So infectious diseases like the coronavirus. Again, population controls are also called limiting factors because they limit the size of the population. For density dependent factors, that means it's the most scarce resource. For example, let's say an environment has plenty of water, plenty of food, plenty of space, and then all of a sudden it runs out of water. Let's say there's a drought as a result of climate change, for example. That most scarce resource, the water, is going to limit the size of the population. Even if there's plenty of other food, if there's plenty of mating spaces or other resources that the species needs, it's that most limited resource that determines what the population size can be, what the carrying capacity is. So populations can fluctuate in a variety of different ways. Usually this is determined by the type of species that you have. Stable populations go above and below carrying capacity, so they can be very stable. Eruptive is when you have something that's stable and then it explodes, like grows rapidly and then decreases rapidly. So raccoons are an example of a species that has exploded, especially in urban populations. Irregular has no set pattern, so the species just kind of grows and falls. Of course, it's probably an environmental reason that determines how they grow and fall, whether it's seasons or other factors. Cyclic are ones that go up and down pretty like in a cycle or a pattern, but there's not necessarily always an explanation for that pattern. So these are some of the things that scientists will study to find out why these populations are changing in certain ways. Here is a graph showing the different types of uh, change in populations. So it often is determined by the type of species and seasonal changes and just the environment in general that they live in. Here's our next pit stop for those of you in class doing Nearpod. If there are many possible limiting factors in an environment, which one determines the carrying capacity in that environment? So think about my example that I just mentioned, where you have many different resources in an environment. Which one of those is going to determine the carrying capacity for that environment? Predators are a very important part of ecosystems. They help to control the population size of all the species below them. Predator prey cycles are not always perfectly well understood, and there's actually a few different ideas about how the predator prey cycles contribute to population control. But what we normally see is a large increase in numbers of prey, and then the predator will rise after that, and then you have these crashes. So I'll show you guys a graph in a slide here of lynx and hares in the Arctic. Lynx are like these cat, I almost said critter. They're huge. They're not critters. They're big cats. And then hares are a form of rabbit, or kind of like a rabbit, related to rabbits. So these two different hypotheses are out there about predator and prey cycles. Top-down control hypothesis is the one that we're most familiar with, and that is where the lynx population, the cats, the big cats, control the hare population. And then the lack of hares, once the lynx have eaten too many of them, controls the lynx population. It causes their population to crash. And then there's another theory or hypothesis that you probably haven't heard of as much called the bottom-up control hypothesis. And this one is one that's being explored by scientists more recently. It's when the hares eat too many plants for their population to continue to sustain itself. And so their population dies when they overuse the resources, and then the lynx population follows afterwards. So those are two competing hypotheses currently about predator and prey cycles. But there's also a possibility that there is a three-way interaction between them. And this is actually just a really good example of how science is always changing and our ideas about it are always changing. Because especially with the study of ecosystems, the complexities are huge. So there's so many different factors that could be playing a role. And so just the simple predator-prey cycles that we thought we saw or we thought we knew may or may not be interacting with other factors. So here's a graph showing the typical predator-prey interaction model, the top-down more specifically, where you have the prey species going up and then the predator species goes up because there's more prey to eat. But once they overeat the prey, then the prey crashes and then the predator crashes. So this is a cycle that we have seen out in nature, but it definitely is not the only one that we've seen. Reproductive patterns are a big factor in determining what a population will be like. So, asexual reproduction, if you remember from biology class, is when all the offspring are clones of the single parent, and that results in very low genetic diversity. Bacteria are a very good example of this type of reproductive pattern. Now, they can often reproduce much more quickly, and they depend on mutations for any genetic variability. Sexual reproduction, though, on the other hand, is when you have a combination of the genes from both parents. And so then you have a bigger amount of genetic diversity involved. 97% of all organisms that we know of on Earth reproduce sexually. And it makes sense because that increased genetic diversity allows a species to survive and reproduce. So, over many, many, many millennia of evolution, you see that genetic diversity surviving. You see 97% of the organisms reproducing in that way. All right, so we're going to differentiate between two different types of species according to the study of populations in nature. Our selected species are oftentimes your generalist species. We talked a little bit about generalists in terms of the where they fall in an ecological niche, but this is a little bit different than that. But they our selected species can sometimes be called generalists. These species reproduce early and they put most of their energy into reproduction. So their goal in life is to reproduce. They generally have a lot of offspring when they reproduce, and they become reproductive early in their lifetimes. They're often shorter lifespans, so they have short generation times. And then the offspring don't often get much parental care. So they're basically born and the young are off to do survival or not. So they have shorter lifespans. And once again, I mentioned that they can sometimes be called your generalist species because they're very much capable of surviving in many environments because of these characteristics about them. And we'll look at a graph to show a little bit of the difference in how these populations change in the different types of species. So our selected species often are your smaller organisms, especially. K-selected species, on the other hand, these are more of your competitive organisms. They're larger in size. They don't put a lot of their lifetime into reproduction. It is a part of their lifetime, but it's not the only time. They reproduce later in their development. They're fairly large in size, so that includes us humans. We mature more slowly, these K-selected species, and tend to be cared for by one or both parents into, not later life, but later into life. So if you think about us, we are cared for until we're at least 18. Some people say we should be cared for even longer than that, but you have a very long period of time where you are being raised by your parents. These kinds of species are also more prone to extinction. They're more sensitive to the types of factors that can cause extinction. So we'll look at a little bit more at that as well. So K-selected versus R-selected species has different advantages when it comes to survivability. So K-selective species are better in constant environments. So ones where there's not a lot of change, where the resources are about the same. We're not super great at surviving when things are disrupted. So think of like the dinosaurs, especially. Once their environmental conditions were disrupted by the asteroid hitting and knocking everything out, a lot of the larger species went extinct first. Now, they do, however, tend to do well in competitive conditions when their population is near carrying capacity. So this allows for better adaptability and survivability. Our selected species, on the other hand, can thrive in ecosystems where there are disturbances. So because they have so many offspring and they have it so quickly, if there's a challenged where they need to have some organisms survive, they have plenty of offspring to dispose of. And that's a really harsh way of saying it, but they can survive because they simply have so many offspring, so much genetic diversity. So disturbances do not hurt them as much as they do K-selected species, the larger species. So a survivorship curve, we're going to look at a slide here in a moment. These curves show the number of survivors in each age group over time. And these are species specific generally. You choose a species to follow, and then you look at them throughout their lifespan. You take numbers of the individuals throughout the lifespan. So it kind of shows the life expectancy and then the probability of death for individuals at each age. You often hear the word mortality as like, that's the measure of death or the rate of death. Survivorship is the opposite. Survivorship is the rate of life or the rate of surviving through different age groups. Here is the graph that I was talking about. So the K-selected species, like us, the larger animals, they tend to have late loss of life. So you're born, and most individuals survive, and then it crashes at the end when you're in old age. In the case of our selected species, you often have a lot of offspring, but many of them don't survive. They don't have parental care to ensure their survivability. So a lot of them die off, but those that do survive can continue on for a relatively long period of time. And then you have a species on a survivorship curve of constant loss, where you have a number that are born, but then the decline is very steady. So you have a constant rate of loss of that type of species. And you can see birds are kind of like that intermediary stage where they are not exactly K-selected, not exactly R-selected. So the three types of survivorship curves that I just described. The early loss is typical for our selected species. So plants that go every year, annual plants. Bony fish, they die very early in life. I often think of I don't know if you guys have ever seen it, the sea turtles on the beach being born and all the seagulls are coming in to get them. That's what I think of when I think of the early lost species. The late lost species would be K-selected species like us. We produce fewer offspring, but we do care for them so they do survive. And then constant loss is kind of an intermediate between the two different reproductive patterns. I'll leave that up there for just a minute for you guys. And here's our next pet stop for those of you doing near potting class. Are humans a K-selected or R-selected species? And what characteristics do we have that make us that? Take a moment to answer that question. So it's no secret in this class that we humans have great effects on ecosystems and the populations in those ecosystems. Fragmentation is something that we do when we split up an ecosystem. So we're making them into fragments. It causes natural ecosystems to lose diversity, lose complexity, and we also waste and destroy a lot of the net primary productivity. I believe you learned about this in chapter 3. So the ability of the plants to create energy for us to consume and other species in the ecosystem to use, we are doing a lot of destruction to that ability of those plants to do that. So we're losing a lot of the ability of our ecosystems to generate energy. We are strengthening some pest species, these generalist R-selected species, and bacteria by overusing our pesticides and overusing antibiotics. So we're actually causing evolution to happen in these R-selected type species, and it's not, it's to the detriment of other species in ecosystems, including ourselves. We also eliminate predators, which can cause a complete disruption of an entire ecosystem. And then introducing alien and invasive species, which also completely disrupts an ecosystem and possibly kills off native species. So all of these different things that we're doing are causing our ecosystems to go haywire, essentially. Over-harvesting resources is another thing. We take more than can be regenerated. We are living unsustainably. So all of these things are impacting how populations are surviving or not surviving on Earth. And then interfering with the biogeochemical cycles that we studied, I think that was in chapter 3 as well, and the flow of energy. Again, the primary productivity is part of that energy production for organisms in the ecosystem. So we are messing with the biogeochemical cycles and energy flow. So those are also major areas where we could improve to improve the quality of Earth's ecosystems. And I just wanted to outline a couple of the areas where you could go into if you were interested in reestablishing these populations in helping species to survive. So conservation biology is one of them. It's a multidisciplinary science, just like or environmental science, and it looks at the human impacts on biodiversity. So the goal is really to come up with approaches to maintain biodiversity, to reestablish ecosystems and maintain ecosystems. And it's mostly concerned with endangered species, wildlife reserves, ecological restoration, and ecological economics. So the money behind restoring these ecosystems and these ecosystem services. And these types of jobs are actually becoming a lot more common as we've realized that our ecosystem services are important to us as humans, not just to our fellow species on Earth. In conservation biology, we recognize that biodiversity is necessary for life on Earth, including ourselves. So we shouldn't cause extinction of wildlife to continue happening at the fast rate that it is happening. And the best way to protect biodiversity is to protect the ecosystems we already have. Now, there is also restoration biology, which is restoring old ecosystems, but that's not a simple strategy. It takes a lot of work to restore an ecosystem, but protecting an ecosystem that's already there is much less intensive. So that tends to be a focus for conservation biology. Wildlife management is another career or area that you could go into, and that also looks at local ecosystems, but especially deals with game species, so hunting and fishing. And oftentimes, hunting and fishing is a way to incentivize people to take care of the environment. We'll go a little bit more into this when we talk about the political influences on environmental science, but hunting and fishing is often a conservative rural activity that helps people appreciate the environment. So wildlife management is an area you could go into, but just recognize that it does deal mostly with the hunting and fishing aspects of being outdoors. Bioinformatics is another area. So this is studying data that has to do with biology and with ecosystems. So it provides tools for scientists to store and access biological information. So there are databases being built that contain information for scientific research. And I introduced you guys to iNaturalist, which is a software that is part of that observational database. So when you are making observations on iNaturalist, that is an example of citizen scientists, what they call it, citizen science, where you are contributing to scientific research on species. All right, so here we are at our summary. Be sure to read through your notes. If you're doing a part 1 and a part 2 of these notes, make sure you go back to the day 1, the part 1, and read through those as well, so that you can capture the main ideas in this presentation on population dynamics.